The moment Mamie Turner stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1879, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made either the bravest decision of her life or the most foolish one, and the dry, biting wind that whipped red dust across the main street seemed to agree that the answer could go either way. She stood on the unpainted boardwalk with a single carpetbag clutched in both hands, her dark hair pinned beneath a bonnet that had seen better days, and she took in the full measure of the town that was supposed to be her new life. Caldwell was a cattle town, sitting right on the edge of the Chisholm Trail, and it wore that fact like a badge and a wound at the same time. The street was wide and rutted, churned up by the hooves of 10,000 longhorns that had passed through in the seasons before. The buildings were rough-cut lumber, most of them sun-bleached to the color of old bone, and there were more saloons visible from where she stood than she could count on one hand. Men moved along the boardwalks with spurs ringing and hats pulled low, and she could already hear the tinny sound of a piano leaking from somewhere she could not quite identify. Mamie was 23 years old, recently widowed after only 8 months of marriage to a man who had been kind enough but who had left her with very little when a fever took him in the hard winter of 1878. She had come west on an advertisement posted in the St. Louis newspaper, responding to a notice placed by a man named Harold Finch, who operated a boarding house and dry goods store in Caldwell, and was in need of a capable woman to help manage the establishment. The arrangement had been described in the letter exchange as a respectable position with room and board included, which had seemed like a reasonable enough foundation on which to rebuild a life. What the letters had not described, and what Mamie discovered within the first hour of her arrival, was that Harold Finch was a man of 53 with a sharp temper, a habit of drinking before noon, and a very different interpretation of what the word arrangement meant. He met her at the stagecoach office with a gap-toothed smile and eyes that moved over her in a way that made the skin on the back of her neck prickle with unease. "Mrs. Turner," he said, reaching for her bag without asking. "You are a fine-looking woman. The advertisement did not do you any justice." "Thank you," she said carefully, keeping hold of the bag. "I am grateful for the position, Mr. Finch. I am a hard worker and I intend to prove useful." His smile widened in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Oh, I expect you will." By the time the afternoon sun had dropped toward the horizon, and she had seen both the boarding house and the cramped, airless room she was to occupy, she had catalogued exactly what she was dealing with. Finch's establishment was run down and poorly kept. The other 2 lodgers were transient cattle workers who treated the place like a stable. The dry goods operation in the front room was half-stocked and dusty, and Finch himself had already made 2 remarks that had no place in a professional arrangement, remarks she had deflected with the cool precision of a woman who had learned early in life that a quiet sharpness was more effective than an outburst. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed in her room that first evening and pressed her hands flat on her knees and thought very carefully about her situation. She had spent the last of her money on the stagecoach fare. She had no family to return to, her parents having both passed before her marriage. Going back east was not an option. She needed the wages, and she needed them now, and she would simply have to manage Finch until she had saved enough to find something better. She told herself it was a plan. It felt more like a wire stretched thin over a very deep drop. The dry goods store opened at 7 in the morning, and Mamie was behind the counter by 6:50, having swept the floor, straightened the shelves, and wiped the glass case that housed Finch's collection of tobacco products. A few customers drifted in during the morning hours, ranchers and their wives mostly, and she served each of them with a calm competence that seemed to surprise them. By midday she had already reorganized the stock of flour and beans, and noticed that Finch was charging irregular prices that she suspected were not entirely honest. It was on the second day, a Tuesday, that Gilbert Alden walked into the store. He came in without any particular fanfare, just a man pushing through the door with the easy movement of someone who had been riding all morning and had a list of things to get done. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled a little at the collar, and a jaw that carried 2 days of dark stubble. He wore the practical clothes of a working cattleman, worn denim and a canvas coat, with a battered hat he removed when he stepped inside. He was 28 years old, though she did not know that yet. What she noticed first was that he looked around the reorganized shelves with a mildly surprised expression, as if the order was not what he had expected to find. "Good morning," Mamie said from behind the counter. "What can I help you with?" He turned to look at her with dark brown eyes that were direct and unhurried, and there was a brief pause before he spoke. "Morning, ma'am. I need a 20-pound sack of cornmeal, a coil of rope, 3 tins of peaches, and whatever you have for boot leather conditioner." "I have the cornmeal and the rope," she said, already moving toward the correct shelves. "2 tins of peaches, not 3 unless Mr. Finch restocked overnight, which I doubt. And I have beeswax, which will serve your boots better than the oil compound he has been selling." He watched her pull the items with efficient precision. "You are new," he said. It was not an accusation, just an observation delivered with a neutral curiosity. 2 days new," she confirmed. "Mamie Turner. I am managing the store for Mr. Finch." "Gilbert Alden," he said, moving to the counter to meet her. "I run the Rocking-A Ranch about 4 miles northwest of town." He picked up the beeswax she set down and turned it over in his hand. "You said this is better than the oil. It seals the leather instead of just softening it," she said. "In this kind of dry heat you want sealing. The oil evaporates too fast." He looked at her with that same unhurried attention. "Where did you learn that?" "My father kept horses." Good leather care was a point of emphasis in our household. The corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "All right," he said. "I will take the beeswax." He set a few coins on the counter. She counted out his change, and they exchanged a nod as he gathered his items. He was nearly at the door when he turned back. "Mrs. Turner," he said, "a word of caution if I may offer it. Harold Finch is not a man of particularly honest character. I have done business here for 3 years, and I have had to reconcile my tab with him more than once. You seem like a capable woman. Just keep your eyes open." She met his gaze steadily. "I appreciate the warning, Mr. Alden. I had already formed a similar impression." Something shifted in his expression, a quality she could not quite name, something between respect and interest. He nodded once more, put his hat back on, and walked out into the Kansas sunlight. Mamie watched the door swing shut and stood very still for a moment, the coins still in her hand, aware that something had just happened without being entirely sure what it was. The weeks that followed were a study in endurance. Mamie worked the store from open to close, kept meticulous accounts that she copied into a small notebook of her own, because she did not trust Finch's ledger, and deflected his increasingly unwelcome advances with a combination of polite firmness and strategic busyness. She befriended the woman who ran the laundry 2 doors down, a sturdy German immigrant named Clara Bauer who had been in Caldwell for 6 years, and who knew everything about everyone in town. Clara filled her in on the key players with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone reading off a livestock manifest. Gilbert Alden, Clara told her, was well regarded. He had come to Kansas from Tennessee 5 years ago with very little, and had built the Rocking-A from scrubland and sheer persistence. He employed a small crew of cowboys, all of them loyal, and he ran about 400 head of cattle with the intention of driving them up the trail to Wichita by midsummer. He was unmarried. He had been, Clara said with a significant look, once engaged to a woman who had decided she preferred the life offered by a banker in Topeka to the life offered by a cattle rancher in Caldwell, and this had apparently made Gilbert Alden somewhat closed off on the subject of personal matters. "But he is a good man," Clara said firmly, stirring a pot of something fragrant on her small stove. "A real good man. Not many of those in a cattle town." Mamie filed this information away without comment and told herself she was not storing it for any particular reason. Gilbert came back to the store the following week for more supplies, and this time the transaction took considerably longer, because he mentioned a problem with one of the ledger charges Finch had put on his account, and Mamie was able to show him from her own copied records that he was correct and Finch had overcharged him. The expression on Gilbert's face when she slid her notebook across the counter toward him and showed him the discrepancy was one of genuine surprise, followed by something that looked very much like admiration. "You keep your own accounts," he said. "I keep my own accounts," she confirmed. He corrected the payment right there at the counter, subtracting the overcharge, and when Finch came down from the back room and started to bluster about it, Mamie set her notebook open in front of both of them and indicated the relevant entries with a calm that she was quite proud of, given that her heart was beating faster than she would have liked. Finch backed down, grumbling, and shot Mamie a look that promised there would be a reckoning later. Gilbert said nothing, but as he turned to leave, he caught her eye and gave her a small, deliberate nod that felt like something solid being placed in her hand. That evening, Finch came to her room door after supper and told her in a low and threatening tone that she was not being paid to run her own separate books and that she should remember her place. Mamie listened to him without moving from where she stood inside the doorway, and then she said very quietly that she was not doing anything she would not be comfortable discussing with the town sheriff, and that she had noticed Sheriff Tom Bowman came into the store regularly for his tobacco, and she had quite enjoyed their brief conversations. It was a bluff, partially. She had spoken to the sheriff exactly twice. But Finch did not know that, and she watched the calculation move behind his eyes, and he stepped back and left without another word. She closed the door and stood against it with her eyes shut for a long moment, breathing slowly, letting the trembling in her hands subside. She was not going to stay here much longer. She knew that with clean certainty. She just needed a little more time, a little more wage money put by, and she needed a different situation. The question was how to find one. The answer came from an unexpected direction, as answers sometimes do. On a warm afternoon in mid-May, when the main street of Caldwell was full of the sound of a cattle crew coming in from the south end of the trail, the rumble and lowing of several hundred longhorns being pushed toward the holding pens. Mamie had stepped out onto the boardwalk to watch, because the sheer scale of a cattle drive was something she had not yet grown accustomed to, and the sight of those big, angular animals moving in a dust-clouded mass was something that demanded to be looked at. She spotted Gilbert Alden on a big gray horse at the flank of the herd, moving the cattle with the practiced ease of a man entirely at home in that context. He was directing two of his cowboys with hand signals and occasional shouted words, and there was something in the way he sat his horse and moved through the work that she found herself watching for longer than was strictly necessary. He saw her standing on the boardwalk. Even at that distance, she caught the moment his eyes found her, and he lifted two fingers from the brim of his hat in a brief acknowledgement before turning his attention back to the cattle. Later that afternoon, after the herd was settled and the dust had more or less subsided, he came into the store. He bought tobacco and a tin of coffee, and while she was wrapping the coffee, he said, without looking directly at her, "You doing all right, Mrs. Turner?" The question was so simple and direct that it caught her slightly off guard. "I am managing," she said. "That is not the same as all right," he said. She looked up from the wrapping and found him watching her with that quiet, steady attention that she had noticed the first time they met, and that she had continued to notice every time since. There was nothing intrusive about it. It was more like the attention of a person who actually listened, which was, she was realizing, quite rare. "No," she agreed. "It is not." A brief silence settled between them. The store was empty of other customers. Outside, two cowboys were arguing about something inconsequential near the water trough. "I need to be direct with you," Gilbert said. "I know it is not entirely my place, but I am going to say it anyway. Finch is not a safe situation for a woman on her own. Most people in this town know that, and the fact that you have managed him this long speaks well of you. but it is only a matter of time before something he does cannot be managed quietly. Mamie set down the wrapped coffee and looked at him. "I know," she said. "I have been saving toward a different situation. How long before you have enough to move on?" She did the calculation she had done many times in her head. Another month, perhaps 6 weeks. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the counter between them, and she could see him working through something internally, the way you could see the current of a river moving beneath still surface water. Then he looked up. "The rocking A does not have a cook," he said. "My last one, an old fellow named Pete Donahue, went back to Missouri to care for his sister in March, and I have been rotating the cooking among my cowboys, which is a charitable description of what has been happening to the food. It is legitimate work, good wages, room in the ranch house with a lock on the door. I am telling you this as a straightforward business proposition." She studied him for a moment. He met her gaze with complete evenness, nothing concealed, nothing pressured, simply an offer stated plainly and left for her to accept or decline. "I appreciate the offer," she said carefully. "I want to be clear about the nature of the arrangement before I accept." "That is a reasonable thing to require," he said. "The nature of the arrangement is, cook and keep the house, paid on the first of each month, your own room, your own time on Sundays, and you are treated with the same respect I require my crew to treat each other with. Nothing further than that unless something further is something you ever want, and I have no expectation of that and no intention of pressuring it." He said it directly and without embarrassment, as if respecting a person's autonomy was simply a matter of course, which in 1879 Kansas was not, in fact, the default position of most men she had encountered. "When would you need me to start?" she asked. "Whenever you are ready to leave here," he said. She thought about it for exactly the length of time it took her to finish wrapping his coffee. Then she handed it to him across the counter and said, "I can be ready by Thursday morning." The corner of his mouth moved into that almost smile. "I will come by with the wagon at 8. He was there at 8 on Thursday with a bay horse and a flatbed wagon, and one of his cowboys, a young man named Thomas Reed, who was barely 18, and who spent the entire drive out to the rocking A talking about his horse with an enthusiasm that Mamie found entirely charming. She sat beside Gilbert on the wagon seat, her carpetbag and a second bag she had acquired in the back, and she watched the Kansas grassland open up around them as the town fell behind. The wide sky overhead, the particular shade of blue that she had decided was unique to this part of the country. Gilbert drove with one hand on the reins and pointed out landmarks occasionally, not in a tour guide way, but in the way of a person accustomed to reading the land like a map. A dry creek bed that ran full in spring, a line of cottonwood trees that marked the north boundary of his property, the remains of a soddy that had belonged to a family who had left for Oregon 2 winters ago. "Do you like it here?" she asked, meaning Kansas, meaning the land, not specifically meaning the rocking A, though that was included. He considered it for a moment. "I did not when I first came," he said. "It is not forgiving country, but I have come to feel that it is honest country. It does not pretend to be something it is not, and I have found that I can respect that." She thought about that for a while as the wagon rolled and the grass moved in long silver waves in the wind. "I think I understand that," she said. He glanced at her sidelong. "Where are you from originally?" "Ohio," she said. "Outside of Columbus, farm country but gentler than this, more trees. Do you miss it?" "I miss the trees," she said honestly. "I am still deciding about everything else." He smiled at that, a real smile, not the almost one, and it changed his face considerably, warming it, making him look younger and more open than the careful reserve of his usual expression. She found that she wanted to see it again. The rocking A was a working ranch in the truest sense, meaning it was functional rather than fine. The main house was a 2-room structure of rough lumber and adobe that had been added to twice, resulting in a somewhat irregular shape that she found oddly appealing. There was a proper cookstove in the main room, which was a relief, and a table large enough to seat 8. Her room was at the back of the house, small and plain but clean, with a window that looked out toward the western pasture. And when she tested the door, the latch was solid and the room was entirely private. The crew was 5 men. Thomas Reed, who she had already met, a wiry Mexican cowboy of about 30 named Roberto Vila, who tipped his hat to her with great courtesy, an older man named Frank Hester, who had been with Gilbert since the beginning, and who looked at her with the measured assessment of someone deciding whether to trust, a taciturn fellow named Ed Coulter, who spoke perhaps 12 words in her first 3 days, and appeared to communicate primarily through eyebrow movements, and a young black cowboy named James Calloway, who was 20 years old and had come up from Texas the previous year, and who had the kind of easy smile that made you feel immediately at ease. She made dinner that first night, a straightforward beef stew with cornbread, and watched the faces around the table when the bowls went down. There was a short silence, the kind that follows the first bite, and then Frank Hester said, "Lord Almighty," in a reverent tone, and James Calloway laughed, and even Ed Coulter made a sound that she interpreted as approval. Gilbert met her eyes across the table with a quiet satisfaction that was better than any elaborate compliment. She settled into the rhythm of the ranch over the following weeks with a surprising ease. The morning started before dawn, breakfast for the crew before they went out, and then the house to manage and supplies to catalog and meals to prepare for midday and evening. It was hard work, but it was honest work, and she found that she did not mind it. The open space of the land was something she was learning to feel rather than just see. The way the silence out here was not truly silence, but a complex fabric of wind and bird and distant cattle sound, and the creak of the windmill near the water tank. She and Gilbert developed a kind of daily commerce of small exchanges. He would come in at midday with whatever had happened in the morning, some problem with a fence line or a decision about the cattle, and she would have food on the table and sometimes a question or an observation about the ranch's accounts, because she had asked to look at them, and he had agreed without hesitation. She found 2 places where his feed supplier was overcharging him, and she showed him in the same way she had shown him in Finch's store, with the ledger open and the numbers pointing clearly to the problem. "You have an extraordinary talent for this," he said, looking at her notes. "Numbers are honest," she said. "They do not try to be what they are not. I find that restful." He looked at her for a moment. "That is the same thing I said about Kansas." She realized he was right and felt a warm, surprised rush of something that she carefully did not examine too closely. On Sunday afternoons, which were her own time, she took to walking the perimeter of the nearest pasture, learning the land in a way that felt increasingly important to her. Gilbert sometimes found reasons to be working near the same area on those afternoons, not intrusively, just present in the same general landscape, and occasionally they would meet at the fence line near the cottonwood trees and stand side by side and talk about things that had nothing to do with cattle or accounts or ranch logistics. He told her about Tennessee, about growing up on his family's farm there, about a younger brother who was still in Memphis and who wrote letters that arrived 2 months after they were sent. He told her about coming west, about the first year when everything had gone wrong at once and he had very nearly given up and gone home. "What kept you?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, his forearms resting on the top fence rail, looking out over the grass. "Pride partly," he said, "stubbornness, but also," he paused, "I had a feeling that this was where I was supposed to be, even when all the evidence suggested otherwise. I have learned to take that feeling seriously." She understood that. She had had a feeling like that when she had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, under the worst possible circumstances, and had felt not defeated but somehow pointed in the right direction. She had not told anyone that, because it was the kind of thing that was hard to say without sounding foolish. She told Gilbert. He turned to look at her with those dark, steady eyes, and the afternoon light was hitting the grass in a way that made everything glow with a soft gold, and he said, "That is not foolish at all. There was something in the air between them in that moment that was new and known at the same time, like recognizing a melody you had never heard played before, but which you somehow already knew all the notes of. Neither of them moved to close the space between them. Neither of them said anything more about it. But it sat there, present and acknowledged, as they walked back toward the house in the long evening light. She did not sleep well that night. June came in with heat, and the smell of cattle and the news from town that a group of trail drivers had gotten into a significant altercation at one of the saloons, resulting in a man being shot and Sheriff Bowman having a very unpleasant week. Caldwell, Clara Bauer wrote to her in the letter that came with the supply wagon, was its usual complicated self. Harold Finch had taken on a new assistant, a young man from Missouri who had left after 2 weeks, and Finch was now running the store himself and doing it badly. Clara thought this was justice. The letter also mentioned, as a footnote, that Finch had been heard asking around about where Mamie had gone, and that Clara had told him with great satisfaction that she did not know. Mamie read this letter twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in her bag. She was not worried about Finch, not exactly, but she was aware of him the way you are aware of a distant sound that might be thunder. She mentioned it to Gilbert that evening, not as a crisis but as a piece of information he should have. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said, "Finch is the kind of man who makes noise. If he actually came out here, I would address it, but I do not think he will. He prefers situations where he has the advantage." "I think that is correct," she said. "I am not frightened of him." "I know you are not," he said simply, and the certainty with which he said it, the uncomplicated confidence in her capability, did something to the inside of her chest that she found difficult to articulate. The cattle drive to Wichita was planned for the first week of July. Gilbert explained the plan to her in the week before, laying out the route on a worn map he kept in the house. It would take about 10 days with a full crew, moving the herd up the Chisholm Trail to the railhead in Wichita, where the cattle buyers would be waiting. He would take the full crew except for Frank Hester, who would stay behind with her to manage the ranch in his absence. She helped them prepare. She packed food supplies for the trail in canvas bags, calculated rations, and spent 2 days making hardtack and dried beef that would travel well. She also helped Gilbert go over the accounts one more time, the estimates of what the cattle would bring at market and what the ranch needed to operate through the winter. On the morning of departure, the crew was up before dawn. The horses were saddled, the supply mule loaded, and the cattle were already lowing and moving in the first gray light of morning. Mamie stood on the porch with a mug of coffee and watched the organized, controlled motion of the whole enterprise from her vantage point, the men moving with practiced efficiency, the cattle beginning to flow north through the gate like a slow brown river. Gilbert came to the porch last. He had his trail gear on, a heavier coat against the early morning cold, saddlebags over his shoulder, and he stopped at the porch steps and looked up at her. "I expect to be back by the 18th, he said. "Frank knows what needs doing. If anything comes up, I will manage," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the growing light. The sounds of the departing herd were moving away now, and in the quiet between them she could hear the windmill turning. "I know you will," he said. Then, as if making a decision, he added, "I find myself less comfortable leaving than I expected to be." She met his gaze steadily, her heart doing something complicated and warm. "Come back safe," she said. He nodded, put his hat on, and walked to where his gray horse was waiting. She watched him mount and turn the horse north and ride away at an easy lope until the dust swallowed him. She was not going to think about how the ranch felt larger and quieter with him gone. She was not going to think about the particular quality of the silence that followed his departure. She was absolutely not going to think about the fact that the 10 days he would be away were going to feel considerably longer than 10 days. She went inside and washed the coffee mugs and got to work. The 10 days passed. They were not, in fact, particularly uneventful. On the 5th day, a section of the east fence came down in a sudden overnight storm that brought more wind than rain, and she and Frank spent the better part of a day repairing it. On the 8th day, she found that the root cellar had a leak that was threatening the stored vegetables, and she managed a temporary repair with canvas and river clay, while Frank attended to a horse that had gone lame. She also made better use of the time by tackling the full reorganization of the storage room and renegotiating in her head the terms of the account with the feed supplier in town, which she planned to present to Gilbert when he returned. She slept less well than usual. She told herself this was because the storms made noise. On the evening of the 17th, she was on the porch watching the last of the sunset drain from the sky when she heard hooves on the road. She was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand up, and she watched the shape of a horse and rider materialize out of the twilight, and she recognized the gray horse before she recognized the man on it. And then Gilbert was there, riding into the yard a day earlier than expected. He swung down from the horse with the stiff deliberateness of a man who had been in the saddle for a very long time, and he looked up at her on the porch, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before on him, something unguarded, something that had been held for 10 days and was now released by simple proximity. "You are early," she said. "Trail was clear," he said. "Cattle sold well." "I rode ahead." She came down the porch steps, which she had not planned to do. She stopped in front of him, and up close she could see the trail dust on his coat and the tiredness around his eyes and something in those eyes that was not tiredness at all. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I am now," he said quietly. The words sat between them in the falling dark, entirely simple, entirely honest, and she felt the warmth of them move through her like the first real heat of spring after a long cold. They stood there for a moment, neither of them moving, the gray horse blowing tiredly beside them, the windmill turning, the first stars coming out overhead in the enormous Kansas sky. "I kept the house," she said finally, because she had to say something and her voice was not quite as steady as she would have liked. "I can see that," he said. He was looking at her, not at the house. "Mamie." It was the first time he had used her given name, and the way he said it, quiet and careful, like something he had been saving, made the steadiness of her voice even less reliable. "Yes," she said. "I thought about you a great deal while I was gone," he said. "I thought about that more than was perhaps strictly appropriate for an employer." "I thought about you a great deal as well," she said. "More than was perhaps strictly appropriate for an employee." He smiled then, the full smile, and she felt it the same way she always did, that warmth moving through her, and she was close enough to see it clearly in the dying light, and she thought that she could look at that smile for a very long time without growing tired of it. "I'm not entirely sure what to do with that information," he said, though his tone suggested he had some ideas. "I think," she said carefully, "that we could perhaps acknowledge what it means and see where that leads us." He reached out and took her hand, which was resting at her side, and held it gently, and she did not pull it back. "That seems like a reasonable course of action," he said. They stood in the yard in the last of the light, holding hands beside the tired gray horse, and she thought that of all the things she had expected when she stepped off that stagecoach in Caldwell in the spring, this was not among them, and that this was entirely all right. The news that Mamie Turner and Gilbert Alden were keeping company traveled through Caldwell's social network at the speed that small-town news always travels, which is to say immediately and with elaboration. Clara Bauer wrote a letter expressing something between delight and vindication. Frank Hester made no comment whatsoever, but was observed smiling to himself over his coffee on several mornings. Thomas Reed asked James Calloway whether he thought the boss and the cook were in love, and James Calloway said he was quite sure of it and had been since roughly April, which Thomas found impressive. Roberto Vila told Mamie privately one afternoon while she was hanging laundry that Mr. Alden was the best man he had worked for in 10 years of cowboying, and that he hoped she knew that. She told him that she had formed that impression independently, and that she appreciated his saying so. The courtship, if it could be called that given the somewhat unconventional nature of their situation, was conducted with a combination of practical reality and genuine tenderness that felt exactly right to both of them. There were no formal calls with parlor chairs and chaperones. There were evenings on the porch watching the sky. There were conversations that started about ranch business and ended somewhere else entirely. There were moments when he was working near the house, and she brought him coffee, and they stood together in the yard saying very little and needing to say very little. He told her, one evening in late July when the heat had broken enough to sit outside comfortably, about the woman who had left for Topeka and the banker. He told it without bitterness, which she found remarkable, just with the straightforward honesty that she was learning was the characteristic quality of everything he said. "I thought for a while that it meant something particular about me," he said. "That I had chosen wrong, that I was asking for something unreasonable in wanting both the ranch and a person to share it with. Those are not unreasonable things to want," she said. "I know that now," he said, and he looked at her when he said it, and she felt that she understood exactly what he meant. She told him in return about her first marriage, about the gentleness of it and the brevity of it, the loss of her husband so early, the way grief had surprised her with its physical weight. She told him about the fear and the determination with which she had come west, the miscalculation with Finch, the way the whole situation had felt like being thrown very hard in a direction she had not chosen, and finding that the landing, unexpected as it was, had placed her somewhere real. He listened to all of it with the same quiet, complete attention he gave to everything, and when she was finished he said, "I am glad you landed here." "So am I," she said. "Exceedingly." In August, Caldwell had one of its periodic episodes of lawlessness, the kind that cattle towns bred regularly when trail season brought rough men and their wages into the same space as the town's saloons and gambling establishments. A series of incidents in the south end of town escalated into a situation that had Sheriff Bowman sleeping in his office, and several of the town's more peaceable residents keeping their heads down. Gilbert drove into town on a Wednesday to pick up supplies and came back with a tightness around his eyes, and a piece of information he delivered over supper that evening in a careful tone. Harold Finch, it seemed, had been part of an incident involving a card game and a man who suspected him of cheating. The details were somewhat murky, but the outcome was that Finch was in a bind with a man called Bryce Dawson, who was not the kind of man you wanted to be in a bind with. He owed Dawson money that he did not have, and Dawson was making it known around town. Mamie listened to this and felt a complicated collection of things, none of them charitable toward Finch, but all of them rooted in the reality that a desperate Finch was a less predictable Finch. "I am telling you," Gilbert said, "because it is information you should have." Dawson asked around about Finch, and someone mentioned Finch had been looking for a woman who had worked for him. "I do not think Dawson cares about you, but I want you to be aware." "Dawson is looking for leverage on Finch," she said, working it through. "That is what I think," he said. "I have nothing Finch wants at this point," she said. "I have no money, no property, nothing that matters to a card debt." "I know that," he said. "I just want you to know what is moving around out there." She reached across the table and covered his hand briefly with her own, a gesture that had become natural to them both over the weeks past. "Thank you," she said. He turned his hand under hers and held it for a moment. "Nothing is going to happen to you," he said quietly. "I want to be clear about that." She believed him, which was its own remarkable thing. The situation with Finch resolved itself the following week in the untidy way that these things often did in cattle towns. Dawson apparently collected his debt through means that nobody in town was particularly eager to discuss in detail, and Finch, by all accounts, left Caldwell by the end of the month on the Wichita stage with his remaining portable assets and no clear destination. Clara Bauer wrote that the dry goods store stood empty and that she expected it would be taken over by the Caldwell Mercantile Association by winter. Mamie read this letter and felt a settled, quiet satisfaction. One more thread tied off. One more thing that was simply behind her now. September brought the first cooler air and the smell of autumn moving in from the north. and with it a quality of light that she had come to associate purely with this part of Kansas, a long, slanting gold that made the grass look like something illuminated from beneath. She spent more time outside as the heat softened, finding reasons to be in the yard or the garden she had planted in a patch near the east side of the house in early summer, which had yielded tomatoes and beans, and enough herbs to make the kitchen smell considerably better than it had in June. She and Gilbert went riding one afternoon in the second week of September, which was a thing they had started doing on Sunday afternoons, she on a quiet brown mare named Rosie, and he on the gray, which was called nothing in particular but which she had taken to calling Missouri on account of its stubbornness, and he had accepted this name without argument. They rode out to a low ridge about a mile from the house where you could see the full sweep of the rocking A's land spread out below, and they sat on their horses side by side in the cooling afternoon and looked at it. "I have been thinking," he said. She waited because she had learned that when he prefaced something this way, it was worth the wait. "I would like to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it properly because you deserve it to be asked properly." She looked at him. He had turned slightly on his horse to face her, and the September light was on him, and he was looking at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded, no careful reserve, nothing held back, just himself, direct and honest and real. "Mamie Turner," he said, "I have known you since April, and in that time you have reorganized my store, fixed my accounts, repaired my fence in a storm, kept this ranch running when I was gone, and become the most important person in my life without my having planned for any of it. I am not a man who does things halfway when I have decided they are right, and I have decided, very clearly, that you are right. I would like you to marry me if you are willing, and I would like you to know that I am asking because I love you and not for any other reason." The prairie was quiet around them. The wind moved through the grass in long, slow waves. Missouri shifted one hoof and then was still again. She thought she had been prepared for this, in the way you think you are prepared for something you have wanted for a while. She had not been. Her chest was full of a feeling so warm and complete that it was difficult to contain, and she sat with it for a moment, just sat with the absolute rightness of this, the open sky and the golden grass and this man looking at her with that clear, patient, honest love. "Yes," she said, and her voice was steady and certain. "I am willing and I love you, and yes." He smiled, the full and wonderful smile, and reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and they sat there on the ridge in the September light with their hands clasped, and the whole of their future spread out below them like the land they could see, wide and full and real. They were married on the second Saturday of October in the small whitewashed church on the north end of Caldwell, with the town's pastor officiating, and a gathering of people that was larger than either of them had quite expected. Clara Bauer was there, resplendent in her best dress, and she cried in a way that she clearly felt required no apology. Frank Hester and the rest of the crew were there in their best clothes, and James Calloway had somehow obtained a fiddle for the occasion and played it remarkably well. Roberto Villa brought flowers from somewhere that no one could quite account for and presented them to Mamie with a bow that had genuine elegance. Sheriff Bowman came, which surprised both of them, and said that it was good to see something cheerful happen in Caldwell for once, which was an honest sentiment even if it was not very eloquent. Mamie wore a dress that Clara had helped her make from a blue fabric she had found in the newly reopened Caldwell Mercantile. A simple dress, well made, without the elaborate trimmings of fashion that she had never much cared for. She wore her hair in a way that Gilbert had seen once and mentioned, very quietly, that he liked, and she carried the flowers Roberto had brought, and when she walked up the aisle and Gilbert turned to see her coming, the expression on his face was something she was going to keep for the rest of her life. He said his vows in the steady, direct voice that she knew, and when he said that he loved her and intended to keep her well and honor her all his days, she believed him with the entirety of her being, because he was a man to whom his word was the most fundamental thing he possessed. She said her own vows back to him with her eyes on his and her voice clear. And when the pastor pronounced them married and Gilbert kissed her with a gentle, certain tenderness that he had never before permitted himself in front of anyone, she was aware of the small gathered crowd in the church making sounds of approval and of James Calloway starting up the fiddle again outside. And none of it was intrusive. All of it was exactly right. They went back to the Rocking A that evening, just the two of them, and the crew had gone to the saloon in town to celebrate in their own fashion, and the house was lit with the lamp light and smelled of the supper she had left warming, and Gilbert sat at the table and watched her move around the kitchen and said, "Mrs. Alden," with a wonder in his voice that made her turn and look at him. "That is me," she said. "It is," he said. "I find that remarkable." She came to the table and sat across from him, and they ate supper together in their own house in the lamplight. And outside, the Kansas night was enormous and full of stars, and she thought that she was, in a way she had not been able to imagine in the spring when she stepped off that stagecoach with a carpetbag and a fraying plan, entirely at home. Winter came to the Kansas plains with the heavy, serious commitment that it always did, and the Rocking A pulled inward against it in the way a working ranch did. The daily routines adjusted to the cold. The cattle moved to the winter pasture nearer the windbreak of scrubby trees along the creek. The firewood stacked high against the house's south wall. The crew took on the repairs and the maintenance that the summer and fall had deferred, and the evenings in the ranch house were long and warm. Mamie learned that Gilbert played chess with a serious dedication that bordered on obsessive, and that he had no one to play with since Frank Hester had once beaten him badly and refused to play again on the grounds that it caused too much ill feeling. She learned the game in 2 weeks from a book he had, and then spent another 3 weeks losing with great cheerfulness, and then, on a stormy December evening, beat him for the first time. He looked at the board for a long moment, and then looked up at her with an expression of pure delighted surprise. "Well," he said. "Frank Hester was right to walk away," she said serenely. He laughed, really laughed, the full unguarded laugh that she loved as much as his smile, and he tipped his king over in surrender and said, "I am going to need a rematch." "Name the date," she said. They played almost every winter evening after that, and the record between them at the end of the season was something they each claimed in their favor, and neither of them kept strict enough count to settle the question, which was entirely intentional on both their parts. In January, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, before the crew was up, just the two of them at the kitchen table with coffee and the gray pre-dawn light coming through the window. She told him directly and watched his face. The expression that moved across it was one of the most complex and beautiful things she had ever seen on a human face. It started with surprise, pure and wide, and then moved through something that was almost overwhelmed, and then settled into a joy so deep and clean that it was like watching a man find something he had been looking for without quite knowing he was looking for it. He reached across the table and took her face in both his hands very carefully, as if she were something infinitely precious, and looked at her for a long moment without saying anything, and his eyes were bright. "Mamie," he said. "Mamie." "I know," she said, and she was crying a little herself, though she had not anticipated that. He came around the table and knelt beside her chair and held her in a way that was completely different from how he normally held her, something in it that was protective and awed at the same time, and she put her arms around him and pressed her face against his hair and thought that this exact moment, was the heart of everything. He was solicitous for the rest of the winter in a way that occasionally made her laugh, not overbearingly, but with a steady, watchful care that she found touching rather than stifling. He carried things that were too heavy without being asked. He made sure the fire was always good before she woke up. He read the one medical book they had in the house about pregnancy with an intensity usually reserved for his accounts ledger. She continued to cook and manage the house and keep the accounts, because she felt well and capable, and when he made any move toward suggesting she rest, she pointed out that idle hands made for an unstable mind, and he acknowledged this and said nothing more about it. Spring returned to the plains, warmer than the year before, the grass greening early in March, the first meadowlarks appearing before anyone had quite expected them. The rocking A prepared for the season's work, the new cattle acquired over the winter to replenish the herd, the fences checked and repaired, the equipment overhauled. Mamie made a decision in April, which was that she wanted to expand the ranch's operations. She presented it to Gilbert one evening with the careful, thorough documentation that was her way with anything she had thought through seriously. The idea was chickens and a kitchen garden scaled up well beyond what she had run the previous summer, with the aim of selling eggs and produce to the boarding houses and hotels in Caldwell, of which there were now 3, and to the company store that provisioned the trail cruise. Gilbert read through her notes with the serious attention he always gave to her ideas, asking questions, turning the numbers over in his hands. Then he looked up. "This is a good plan," he said. "I know," she said, and he smiled. "What do you need to start?" she told him. He provided it without hesitation. By the middle of May, there were 32 chickens in a coop she had designed herself with Frank Hester's considerably grumbling assistance. And the kitchen garden was 3 times the size of the previous year, and being managed with an enthusiasm that had Thomas Reed drafted as an assistant gardener, a role he accepted with remarkably good grace considering he was primarily a cowboy. The eggs and produce began selling to Caldwell by June, and the income, while modest, was clean and regular and entirely hers. She kept its accounts separately from the ranch accounts, though she and Gilbert reviewed both together at the end of each month with the same collaborative efficiency that characterized everything they did together. Clara Bauer came out to visit in June, making the trip in a borrowed buggy, and spent a Sunday afternoon sitting on the porch with Mamie, drinking coffee and looking out over the land. Clara looked at the garden and the chicken coop and the organized, warm, real life that Mamie had built, and she said, "I told you he was a good man." "You did," Mamie said. "You were right." "I am usually right," Clara said comfortably. "It is one of my best qualities." Their son was born on a hot night in late July, delivered by the midwife who came out from Caldwell, a capable woman named Mrs. Adela Cruz, who was matter-of-fact and skilled, and who had brought more children into the Kansas world than she could count. It was a long labor and a hard one, and Gilbert spent the entirety of it in the room next door in a state of controlled anxiety that Frank Hester managed by keeping him supplied with coffee and later something stronger. When Mrs. Cruz opened the door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Alden, and your wife is well," Gilbert said afterward that he was not entirely sure how he moved from the chair to the room, only that he was there very quickly. Mamie was exhausted and shining with it, and she had the baby in her arms, and the baby was red-faced and loud and entirely perfect, and Gilbert sat beside her on the bed and looked at the two of them with an expression that she kept in her heart like a kept flame. "Hello," Gilbert said to his son, with a soft wonder. The baby did not respond in any useful way, but continued to make his displeasure with the world known at volume. "He is very opinionated," Mamie said. "He is," Gilbert said. "I think he will fit in here just fine." They named him Thomas Edward Alden, for both the first letter of Thomas Reed's name, who had been delighted, and for Edward as a family name of Gilbert's from Tennessee. The crew were, without exception, completely undone by the baby. Ed Coulter, the man of 12 words and expressive eyebrows, spent an entire afternoon sitting with the baby on the porch and did not say a single word but did not need to. James Calloway played the fiddle softly outside the house for a week running, because he said it was good for babies to hear music. Roberto Villa made a cradle board in the style he had learned as a child, working with beautiful care, and presented it to Mamie with the same elegant bow he had given the wedding flowers. Thomas Reed was the baby's godfather, a role he took with an earnestness that made everyone's hearts large and tender. The summer moved into fall and fall into winter, and the rocking A continued to grow, careful and steady, the way anything built on honest foundations and genuine labor grows. Gilbert expanded the cattle operation by the second year, taking on a lease of additional grazing land to the north. Mamie's egg and produce business had become enough of a going concern that she had a regular route to Caldwell twice a week, which she ran herself in the small buggy, enjoying the drive and the business of it and the conversations in town. She had become a person in the community in her own right, not only as Gilbert Alden's wife, but as a woman of practical good sense and fair dealing, who was known to be honest with her numbers and direct with her opinions. She was involved in the organization of a small lending library that a group of the town's women established in the back of the newly reopened and properly run dry goods store, which was now operated by a family named the Carpenters who ran it honestly and well. She and Gilbert had their disagreements, of course, as any two people with genuine characters and genuine opinions will have. There was a significant and several days-long argument about the correct approach to a problem with the water rights on the North Lease that was resolved only by Mamie drawing up an extremely detailed legal summary of the applicable Kansas water law from a copy of the territorial statutes she had borrowed from the courthouse, and presenting it across the dinner table in the way she presented all arguments, with documented clarity. Gilbert read it carefully, acknowledged that she was right, and said, without any apparent embarrassment, "I should know by now not to argue against you when you have done the research." "You should," she agreed pleasantly, and they went on with supper. Their son grew. He was a serious, curious child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determination, and he had opinions about everything from the age of 2, with a conviction that indicated he had fully inherited the household's characteristic stubbornness. He followed Gilbert around the ranch with an attentive seriousness, and he helped Mamie in the kitchen with a focused enthusiasm that meant occasional disasters, but always genuine effort. Frank Hester, who by the time Thomas Edward was 3 had become the boy's devoted and entirely unofficial grandfather, taught him the names of every horse on the property and the proper way to hold a rope. In the spring of 1882, the 4th year of their marriage, Mamie told Gilbert at the breakfast table that there would be a second child. He received this news with the same expression he had given the first announcement, wonder layered over joy, layered over a love so plain and deep it needed no language, and he covered her hand with his across the table in the morning light and held it. Thomas Edward, who was sitting on the other side of the table eating cornmeal porridge with great concentration, looked up at their expressions and said, "What happened?" "You are going to have a brother or sister," Mamie told him. He considered this with the gravitas of a 3-year-old confronting an important fact. Then he said, "I would prefer a dog." Gilbert laughed so hard he nearly fell off his chair, and Mamie felt the familiar warm helplessness of it, the way joy in this house moved so naturally to laughter, and laughter moved so naturally to love. Their daughter was born in December of 1882, in the first heavy snowfall of the season, in the warm kitchen of the ranch house because the midwife was delayed by the snow, and it was Frank Hester, of all people, who proved unexpectedly useful in the situation, having considerable experience with difficult births in his years of ranching. Though he never afterward spoke of the details of that night, except to say that Mrs. Alden was the most composed person he had ever encountered under difficult circumstances, which was true. They named her Clara June Alden, the first name for Clara Bauer, who was genuinely overwhelmed when she was told, and June for the month Mamie had always associated with the beginning of things, the month her egg business had started, the month she had first admitted to herself on a Sunday afternoon at a fence line that she was in love with the man she now called her husband. Thomas Edward, after making his position on the subject clear in advance, turned out to be an extremely devoted older brother. His objection to the concept had been theoretical. The actual small person, once she arrived and proved to be real and interested in him, was a different matter entirely. By the winter of 1883, which was 4 years from the spring Mamie Turner had stepped off a stagecoach with a carpetbag and a fraying plan, and a quiet sense of direction she could not entirely explain, the rocking A had become a flourishing operation. The cattle herd numbered nearly 600. The egg and produce business was firmly established and regularly profitable. The ranch house had been extended twice and had a proper parlor now, with bookshelves that held the lending library books that occasionally came home with Mamie and the chess set, and the territorial statutes volume, and a growing collection of practical texts on farming, medicine, and ranch management. The crew had grown and changed somewhat, though James Calloway and Roberto Vila were still there, and Frank Hester showed no sign of ever leaving, having announced when someone asked him about retirement that he had no idea what that word was supposed to mean. Thomas Reed had left the previous spring to start his own small operation on land he had saved for over 3 years, and they had sent him off with a dinner and good tools and Frank Hester's complicated approval, which was the highest recommendation anyone could receive. On a January evening in 1883, when the children were asleep and the fire was good and the snow was settling quietly outside, Mamie and Gilbert sat in the parlor with their chess board between them, and the lamp turned up warm against the winter dark. The game had been going for an hour, and it was, as it had been for 4 years, genuinely competitive and slightly contentious in the best possible way. She moved her bishop and sat back with a satisfaction she did not hide. He looked at the board, looked at her, looked at the board again. "That is," he said, "extremely irritating. You have 3 moves," she said, "none of them good." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her across the board with the dark, warm, entirely open eyes that she knew as well as she knew anything in the world, and he smiled. "How did I get here?" he said, and it was not really a question. It was something else, something he said sometimes, usually in moments like this, moments when the fullness of what they had built together was particularly present. "You worked very hard," she said, "and you were a man of honest character. And you offered a legitimate business proposition to a woman in difficult circumstances. And she reorganized my store," he said. "And she reorganized your store," she agreed. "And she has beaten me at chess more times than I am comfortable admitting. The actual count is available in the ledger," she said. He laughed, and she felt it as she always did, warm and familiar and still, 4 years in, capable of making her heart move with something that was uncomplicated happiness. He reached across the chess board and took her hand, the same gesture across the same kind of table, as the first morning she had told him about the baby, as the morning he had taken her hand on the wagon seat and pointed out the cottonwood trees on the north boundary, as every morning and evening of these years that had turned into her life, into the life that she had been pointed toward without knowing it on a spring morning in a Kansas cattle town with a carpetbag, and the knowledge that she needed to simply begin. "I love you," he said. "I love you," she said back, direct and certain, the way she said everything that was true. Outside, the snow fell on the wide Kansas prairie, and the windmill turned slow in the winter dark, and the cattle were settled in the winter pasture, and the children slept warm in the ranch house that was their home, and the lamp burned steady against the cold, and the life they had built together out of honest work and practical sense, and a love that had arrived without announcement and stayed without question, was as solid and real and enduring as the land it was planted in. She looked at the chess board and then at him and said, "You have 2 moves now, actually. I miscounted." "Which are they?" he asked. "Both of them end the same way," she said. He considered this with perfect good humor and said, "Then I suppose I am done." He tipped his king over, and she felt the small, sweet satisfaction of it, and he was smiling, and the fire was warm, and the snow fell outside on their land, and that was enough. That was everything.